What if the very thing people mocked you for, your size, your silence, your background, became the source of your power? What if the world pointed and laughed, but you stepped forward anyway, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right? This is the story of a girl they tried to shrink into the shadows of her mother's uniform, a maid's daughter, chubby and unseen. But what they didn't realize was that, while they whispered, she was listening. While they overlooked her, she was learning. And while they blocked the doors, she was quietly building her own stage. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of reclamation of what happens when a child steps into her own name and leaves a trail for others to follow. Stay with us, because the spotlight doesn't always find the loudest voice. Sometimes it finds the one who never stopped showing up. It all begins in a place that smells faintly of eucalyptus and floor polish, a building with stained glass windows taller than most living room walls, where ballet slippers whisper secrets across polished floors. The kind of place where ambition wears a leotard and legacy is passed down like heirlooms. This is not where you'd expect to find Eliana Vega, a stocky, quiet 12-year-old with dark curls tied back too tightly and a second-hand duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She walks the halls of the Linwood Ballet Conservatory like a ghost in her own story, eyes downcast, carefully avoiding the gazes of girls who don't need to ask who she is. They already know she's the help's daughter. But not just that, she's Eliana Vega's daughter, the building's longtime janitor who also happens to mop the floors of half the homes her classmates live in. And in a school where lineage and legacy are stitched into costumes and whispered over cucumber water that makes Eliana invisible, or worse, an inconvenience. You'd think that in 2024, a child's body type, skin tone, or socioeconomic background wouldn't still determine how far her feet are allowed to travel across a stage. But then again, dance has always been a mirror of grace, yes, but also of exclusion. Eliana knows this. She's known it since the first time she saw her mother cleaning Studio C while the other girls spun and laughed, never once offering a fowling hello. Ramira, with her hands calloused and strong, had once danced 2 folk dances of Venezuela, fluid and powerful, but she never said much about that. She just watched her daughter with eyes that carried decades of silence. That morning, Eliana had arrived earlier than usual, even for her. She liked to sneak into Studio A before the instructors arrived, to stretch, to rehearse, to just exist without the eyes. And there, under the flicker of the old light bulbs, she practiced what no one had ever taught her: precision, expression, presence. Her fouettes weren't perfect, but they were filled with something most trained dancers forget to chase: honesty. That afternoon, the girls noticed, not in a good way. Madison Alcott and Serena Lane, 2 leggy, pedigreed students, with names that sounded like private schools, caught a glimpse through the door and exchanged smirks. "Do it again," Madison said later that day, her tone dripping with performance. Eliana looked up, cautious. "Excuse me? You were spinning like a cartoon ballerina earlier. Bet you can't do even 5 fouettes without falling." It wasn't a challenge. It was bait. Serena pulled out her phone. Others gathered. A circle formed, not to admire, but to consume. "Go on," Madison said, her voice sweet and venomous. "Unless you're too dizzy." Eliana Vega. It wasn't just her name that held weight in that moment. It was everything it implied. You don't belong here. You don't get to take up this space. But what they didn't know what they had, never bothered to learn, was that Eliana didn't just rehearse before school. She trained with her mother every morning before sunrise. In the cramped living room of their apartment, on warped hardwood floors, with music from a cracked speaker and guidance whispered in Spanish, Ramira taught her not just to turn, but to anchor. Don't spin to impress, she'd say. Spin to remember who you are. Eliana stood in the middle of the room, and with no music, no warm-up, no forgiveness, she began. 1, 2, 3. Her body sliced through the air like punctuation, marks in a sentence no one thought she had the right to write. 4, 5, 6. Her gaze locked on the mirror. Her shoulders. Square. 8, 9, 10. Madison's smirk faltered. Serena lowered the phone. 11, 12, 13. Eliana wasn't proving herself. She was revealing what had always been there. 30, 31, 32. And then she kept going. Not because she had to, but because the silence felt holy. 40, 41, 42. When she finally stopped, she didn't collapse. She simply nodded and walked away. No applause, no victory lap. Just a quiet reclaiming of space that had never been offered to her, but which she took anyway. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stand where they said you couldn't, and spin. In the hours after Eliana's defiant performance, something shifted, but not publicly, not yet. The girls who had gathered that day scattered like guilty whispers. Serena deleted the video off her phone, though she knew someone else had already saved it. Madison, too stunned to taunt, offered only a half-hearted shrug and walked away. But what had taken place wasn't just a moment, it was a rupture. A rip in the invisible social contract that said girls like Eliana were allowed to be janitors' daughters, not center stage dancers. That evening, back in the quiet apartment above the grocery store where Ramira cleaned floors after hours, Eliana didn't talk about what happened. She simply sat on the couch and laced up her slippers again. Ramira watched her silently, handed her a thermos of tea, and whispered only this: "You did not spin to please. You spun to be heard." The next day, whispers started circulating. Not admiration, confusion, envy, even. "She only did that because her mom works here," someone murmured in the locker room. "She's not even enrolled in the elite track," another replied. These weren't statements, they were excuses. Because when power feels threatened by authenticity, it finds 1,000 ways to rationalize its discomfort. Linwood Ballet Conservatory had long prided itself on selective excellence, a term that sounded noble until you realized what it really meant was, we like our talent to look familiar, tall, slender, pale, polished. Eliana was none of those things. She was powerful. That's different. And far more dangerous to the status quo. Meanwhile, word of her performance began trickling up the ranks. Miss Corinne, one of the assistant instructors, had overheard her own niece talking about the maid's daughter who outspun everyone. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. By the following week, the conservatory's director, Madame Bellamy, had received 2 separate emails, one urging her to investigate whether Eliana had disrupted class time, and another, quietly, suggesting she observed the girl dance. But it wasn't the emails that changed anything. It was Sofia Ramos, the quietest girl in the elite program. Her father sat on Linwood's donor board. Her mother was a former professional ballerina. She had the pedigree, the poise, and the privacy to say nothing. But instead, she uploaded a clip to her private account, 27 seconds of Eliana mid-turn, eyes locked, posture defiant. And in the caption, she wrote just 3 words: "She's the truth." The post went viral, not overnight, but like a slow burn. Other dancers began resharing it. Young girls of color from other schools commented with fire emojis and tags. "Who is this? I want to dance like her. Why haven't we seen her on stage?" And like all viral moments, the attention brought both light and shadow. One local news blogger featured Eliana in a post titled "The Hidden Talent Inside Linwood's Walls." In it, she speculated on Eliana's background, her relationship to the staff, even her BMI. Comments poured in, some praising her raw ability, others dissecting her waistline, her silence, her smile, her mother. Because when society doesn't know what to do with your excellence, it picks you apart instead. But Eliana didn't read the comments. She kept dancing every morning before school, every evening before dinner, because to her, movement wasn't performance, it was memory. Her turns were how she kept her grandmother's lullabies alive. Her posture was how she held dignity in a world constantly trying to shrink her. And her mother? Ramira never said, "I'm proud." She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. A woman who had scrubbed mirrors for 20 years now saw her daughter, reflected in them on her own terms. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. Within 2 weeks, Eliana Vega had become a name you either pretended not to know or couldn't stop talking about. She hadn't auditioned for a lead role. She hadn't spoken on camera. She hadn't sat for interviews or lobbied for attention. All she had done was spin. And that, somehow, had been enough to shake the scaffolding of a centuries-old institution. But the Linwood Ballet Conservatory didn't change overnight. Institutions rarely do. It responded first with a thin layer of politeness, inviting Eliana to a special weekend workshop reserved for developing talents. But even a child could smell the choreography behind that offer. It wasn't opportunity. It was containment. If they couldn't ignore her, they'd try to manage her. Meanwhile, backstage, the murmurs continued. Girls whispered about her sponsorship, about how she must have had help. There's no way she just showed up with talent like that. Someone said, she doesn't even have a real coach. But she did have a coach, her mother. And what Eliana Vega lacked in elite certifications, she made up for in devotion and in knowledge passed down through generations of women who moved not for applause, but for survival. By now, Madame Bellamy had seen the footage herself. She hadn't commented publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence rang out louder than applause. It was the silence of someone both impressed and unsettled. Because Eliana wasn't just good, she was a reminder of how many girls had been overlooked, of how many gatekeepers had dismissed power because it wasn't polished. And that was uncomfortable. Power without permission always is. One day, Ramira received a formal invitation in the mail, an embossed card, requesting her presence at the Linwood Donors Gala. It wasn't addressed to Eliana. It was addressed to Mrs. Eliana Vega and guest. Ramira almost threw it away. She didn't go to galas. But Eliana took the envelope gently, turned it over and said, "Let's just see what they think we'll wear." The night of the event, Ramira arrived in a deep maroon dress, her curls pulled back with a velvet ribbon, and Eliana wore a simple navy gown with flat shoes. No jewelry, no pretense, just presence. They didn't smile too much. They didn't linger by the fruit tower. They just stood. And somehow, that stillness disrupted the room more than the champagne flutes clinking around them. One board member approached, then another. But it was Sophia's mother, former ballerina turned patron, who walked directly to Eliana and said, "My daughter thinks you're the reason she remembered why she started dancing." Eliana blinked. That was the first time anyone in power had acknowledged her existence as inspiration, not exception. And while that might sound small, it wasn't. It was a crack, a fracture in the wall, because you can't build a future on walls. You build it through mirrors, honest ones. And for the first time in Linwood's recent history, the mirror had started reflecting back something the conservatory wasn't ready for: truth in motion. After the gala, Eliana wasn't given a lead role. She wasn't handed the keys to the kingdom, but she was quietly offered a scholarship. No announcement, no PR, just an email with the subject line, "Talent Grant Extension Confidential." It wasn't respect. It was strategy. And Eliana knew it. She took the scholarship anyway. Not as gratitude, as leverage. Because sometimes, to change the rules, you first have to play the game. By the time autumn colored the trees around Linwood Conservatory, Eliana had become something more than a girl with good turns. She had become a presence, quiet but undeniable. The kind that makes people clear their throats before speaking, double-check their tone when asking a question. She still wasn't invited to every elite rehearsal, but she didn't need to be. Because now the girls rehearsing inside those mirrored rooms were practicing harder because she might be watching. What the staff never anticipated was that Eliana's influence wouldn't come from access. It would come from gravity. She didn't orbit around the institution. She pulled it toward her. Her new schedule allowed for more training, and one of the younger instructors, Ms. Keiko, began staying late to work with her. It wasn't official. It wasn't sanctioned, but it was sincere. Keiko saw something in Eliana that transcended classical. Forms and instinct, a precision of soul. "You don't just dance," she told her one evening. "You testify." It was around this time that Ramira found a stack of letters in Eliana's backpack notes written by younger students in Wobbly. Handwriting. "I want to be like you. Thank you for showing me how to be brave. You make me feel seen." And this is where the narrative shifts, because Eliana didn't just become a better dancer. She became a mirror for others. The younger. Girls, especially the ones who had never seen their reflection in the studio glass, started standing taller, started raising their hands, started staying after class just to be near her. One even asked if she could sit behind Eliana in warm-ups. "Because it helps me focus." Eliana didn't smile. She nodded. That was enough. The conservatory didn't know how to handle this ripple effect. They liked inspiration, but only the curated kind. A child like Eliana wasn't part of the brochure. She didn't come with legacy or pedigree or philanthropic clout. She came with questions, like why there were no dancers of color in the conservatory's top-tier solos. Why costumes were ordered in nude tones that matched only one kind of skin. Why the financial aid form required recommendations from people in the arts, when most of the applicants who truly needed aid had no access to those circles. When Ms. Keiko brought these questions to the administration, the response was tepid at best. "We appreciate the feedback," they said. "We'll consider revisions." What they meant was, we didn't expect the janitor's daughter to start inspiring audits. But it was too late. The spark had already ignited. Outside of Linwood, Eliana's video continued to circulate. A dance blog interviewed Sofia Ramos about the moment. She reminded us that dance isn't about how perfect your turnout is. Sofia said, "It's about how real you're willing to be in the moment." Other dancers in other cities started using the hashtag spin like ELIANA. Schools began requesting her clip for motivation days. And yet inside Linwood's marble halls, her name was still spoken softly, like it might break something. But Eliana, she wasn't asking to be accepted anymore. She was carving out space for others. She and Ms. Keiko began organizing unofficial warm-ups on Sunday mornings. Anyone could come. No hierarchy. No audition. Just movement. That space became a sanctuary, not just for kids of color or working-class families, but for anyone who had ever been told their worth had to be proven before it could be honored. Ramira often sat in the corner with a thermos of coffee, watching, smiling, saying little. She didn't need to say much. She had already done her part. She had planted the roots. Eliana was the tree. Recognition, when it finally arrived, didn't come in the form of trophies or feature spreads. It came as a casting decision. A subtle one, but seismic. Linwood's annual winter showcase, the Frost and Fire Gala, was both performance and ritual. A black-tie event where legacy families mingled, cameras flashed, and soloists were often launched into their careers. For decades, the role of Winter Flame, the closing solo, had been danced by a girl from one of the conservatory's elite track families. Not always the most talented, but always the most connected. This year, however, a rumor leaked before the official announcement. Eliana Vega's name was on the short list. It started as gossip. "No way," some girls scoffed. "She doesn't have the polish. She's not part of the elite rotation." But beneath the denials, there was tension. Because everyone knew the unspoken truth. If she got that role, it would mean more than a part. It would mean the wall had cracked. When the casting sheet went up, there was no ceremony. Just a thin piece of paper, taped crookedly to the green room door. The list was alphabetical. Girls crowded around. Some shrieked. Some sighed. Eliana waited. Then she read, "Winter Flame, E. Vega." It was silent for a beat. Then the room buzzed, not with congratulations, but with disbelief. "It's political." Someone muttered, "They just want to look inclusive. She doesn't even have the lines." Eliana said nothing. She simply nodded, stepped back, and folded her arms. She wasn't shocked by the role. She was bracing for the backlash. And it came swiftly. Not from the instructors, who now walked a tightrope of diplomatic professionalism, but from the dean, students, the social media comments, the passive-aggressive whispers. A few parents even wrote anonymous emails to the board. "While we support diversity," one said, "we're concerned about the dilution of artistic standards." Translation: "We're fine with her dancing, just not too well." But Eliana kept rehearsing, not because she had something to prove, because she had already proven it, and now it was about presence, persistence, proof that she belonged not by exception, but by inevitability. Meanwhile, Ramira bought a new pair of shoes, not for the stage, for the audience. She would sit in the front row that night, not as a janitor, not as a staff member, but as a mother. As a witness, Ms. Keiko began pushing Eliana harder than then. Ever, not to impress, to endure. "They're not watching to see you fall," she said one night, adjusting Eliana's arm. "They're watching to see what you'll do when you rise," and rise she did. The choreography was brutal, a mix of classical and contemporary, requiring stamina, grace, and storytelling. Eliana trained like someone entering a quiet war, not against anyone, but against the assumptions laid on her shoulders since birth. On the night of the performance, the auditorium buzzed. Donors, press, alumni. The air was heavy with anticipation and scrutiny. Ramira sat center left, hands clasped, nerves silent. The music began. The curtain lifted. And Eliana Vega stepped onto the stage, no longer a shadow, no longer a whisper. Just fire. The moment Eliana's foot hit the marley floor, the audience leaned in. Not forward, not loud, just that collective hush that happens when something real begins. She didn't dazzle with theatrics. She didn't overreach. She moved with the kind of clarity that doesn't beg to be liked. It just is. Her limbs carved the air with calm authority, each extension rooted in something deeper than muscle memory. This wasn't a girl dancing for a spotlight. This was someone translating legacy, her mother's sacrifices, her grandmother's prayers, her own long silences, into movement. The lighting warmed as her solo unfolded, and with it, the illusion of Linwood's narrative control began to flicker. This girl, the one they'd almost kept offstage, was not just holding the role, she was redefining it. "In the wings, Sophia." Ramos exhaled audibly. Backstage, one of the instructors lowered her clipboard slowly, eyes fixed. And in the crowd, Ramira didn't cry. She watched, back straight, hands folded, expression still. She wasn't surprised. She was remembering. The music slowed. Eliana stepped to center stage, turned once, twice, then stopped. Held and bowed. It wasn't the kind of bow you see after begging to be accepted. It was the kind offered when you've claimed the space you already deserved. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous at first, but it built. Like people were remembering how to clap for something they hadn't rehearsed being moved by. Afterward, backstage, there were no bouquets, no media huddle. Just Ms. Keiko pulling Eliana into a long wordless embrace, and Ramira waiting by the stage door, holding her coat. On the ride home, neither spoke for a while. Then Ramira asked, "Did you feel free up there?" Eliana stared out the window, then replied softly, "No, not free, just full." That's when Ramira smiled. The next week, the conservatory featured a photo from the gala on its social feed. Eliana was tagged, but the caption made no mention of her background, her scholarship, her journey. It simply read, "Winter Flame, Eliana Vega, 15, and somehow that was enough. Because erasure doesn't always come from silence, it can also come from simplification. But this time, Eliana wasn't erased. She was just seen. The following month, Linwood's board quietly revised its scholarship criteria. Costumes were expanded to include multiple skin tones. and a new after-hours mentorship program was introduced run by Ms. Keiko, sponsored anonymously. Eliana attended the first session. She didn't teach. She didn't lecture. She sat in the back, notebook in hand, until one girl raised her hand and asked, "How do you know you're good enough when nobody says it?" Eliana met her gaze, then answered, "You stop asking." Eliana Vega didn't rewrite the rules. She revealed that the rules had always been broken, just buried under politeness, pedigree, and polished resumes. Her story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a viral moment. It's about what happens when one underestimated child dares to stand still while the world tells her to shrink. It's about how legacy isn't just inherited. It can be built, turned, spun, and rewritten with every brave step forward. For every girl who's been called too much, not enough, or out of place, Eliana's story whispers, "You are the place. You are the stage. And you never needed permission to begin."